The brain monitors shouldn't be showing this. Dr. Jennifer Anderson stared at the screens surrounding Sarah Matthews's bed, watching patterns of neural activity that violated everything she had learned in medical school. Sarah had been in a coma for 3 months following a traumatic car accident, and for the past 72 hours, her brain scans had shown virtually no activity, the kind of flatlined readings that typically indicated permanent brain death. The family had accepted the inevitable and was preparing to say goodbye when something unprecedented began happening. As Elvis's voice drifted through the hospital's ventilation system from a charity concert 2 floors below, Sarah's brain monitors lit up like a Christmas tree. Alpha waves during Love Me Tender, theta spikes during Can't Help Falling in Love, and delta patterns that Dr. Anderson had never seen in 15 years of neurology practice. The machines were recording brain activity levels that suggested not just consciousness but heightened awareness. Medical textbooks said this was impossible. 3 months of coma, 72 hours of brain silence, and now neural fireworks triggered by music. Dr. Anderson reached for her phone to call the hospital's neurological team, but what happened next would make her realize that some miracles can't be explained by medical science. But to understand why Elvis's voice could reach a mind that medical science had given up on, you need to know about Sarah's secret medical history that her family had never mentioned to the doctors. It was October 22, 1976, at Nashville General Hospital. Sarah Matthews, a 26-year-old music teacher, lay unconscious in the intensive care unit's bed number 7, surrounded by machines that had been keeping her alive since July 15th. The car accident that had changed everything happened on a rainy Tuesday evening when Sarah was driving home from teaching piano lessons to underprivileged children at the community center. A drunk driver ran a red light, and the impact sent Sarah's small Honda spinning into a concrete barrier at 60 miles per hour. The initial diagnosis had been devastating: severe traumatic brain injury with widespread cortical damage. Dr. Anderson, the hospital's chief neurologist, had seen similar cases before. Most patients with Sarah's level of brain trauma never regained consciousness. Those who did often faced permanent cognitive impairment, memory loss, and a quality of life that bore little resemblance to their former selves. Margaret Matthews had spent every day at her daughter's bedside for 3 months, talking to her, playing her favorite music, reading her favorite books, but nothing had produced even the slightest response. Sarah's eyes remained closed, her body motionless except for the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest controlled by the ventilator. Margaret had tried everything the doctors suggested and many things they hadn't. She brought Sarah's favorite perfume, hoping familiar scents might trigger memories. She played recordings of family gatherings, old voice messages, even sounds from Sarah's childhood piano recitals. Nothing worked. The medical team had begun discussing end-of-life care options. Dr. Anderson had gently suggested that after 3 months of no improvement, the family might want to consider making Sarah more comfortable rather than continuing aggressive treatment. The conversation that no parent ever wants to have was scheduled for tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Margaret had called Sarah's father, her siblings, her closest friends. Everyone was flying in to say goodbye. Sarah's piano students had made a recording of themselves playing her favorite songs. Her colleagues at the community center had written letters sharing memories of her dedication to teaching music to underprivileged children. Everyone was preparing for the end of a life that had barely begun to reach its full potential. "Nurse Patricia, check these readings," Dr. Anderson called out as she watched the monitors surrounding Sarah's bed spike with activity that shouldn't have been possible. Patricia Williams, a veteran ICU nurse who had worked with coma patients for 20 years, rushed over to examine the brain activity monitors. "Doctor, I've never seen patterns like this," Patricia whispered, her voice filled with amazement. "Look at these theta waves. They're synchronizing with the music from downstairs." 2 floors below, Elvis was performing an unannounced charity concert in the hospital's main auditorium. He had arrived that afternoon to visit sick children in the pediatric ward, but when he learned about the hospital's financial struggles, he had spontaneously offered to perform a benefit concert. The auditorium was packed with hospital staff, patients' families, and local media who had rushed to cover this unexpected event. But Elvis had no idea that his voice was traveling through the building's ventilation system, reaching every floor, every room, including the intensive care unit where Sarah Matthews lay surrounded by machines and her desperate family. The hospital's outdated ventilation system, which administration had been planning to replace for months, had become an unexpected miracle delivery system. Sound traveled through the metal ducts with surprising clarity, carrying Elvis's voice to places where hope had all but died. In room 7, something that medical science couldn't explain was beginning to happen. The brain that doctors had declared irreversibly damaged was starting to respond to stimuli in ways that violated every principle of neurology. But this wasn't random neural activity. This was organized, purposeful, almost as if Sarah's consciousness was fighting its way back through the darkness, following the sound of a voice that had saved her once before. Dr. Anderson had been studying Sarah's case for weeks, puzzled by certain anomalies in her medical history that didn't fit the typical pattern of severe traumatic brain injury. Unlike most coma patients, Sarah showed unusual responses to auditory stimuli during her initial neurological assessments. Her brain would show brief spikes of activity when exposed to certain sounds, particularly music, but these responses had been too inconsistent and too brief to draw any meaningful medical conclusions. The neurological team had run every test available: MRI scans, CT scans, EEGs, PT scans, and experimental procedures that pushed the boundaries of current medical technology. The results were always the same: widespread cortical damage, consistent with permanent vegetative state. Sarah's brain showed none of the activity patterns associated with consciousness, memory formation, or higher cognitive function. What the medical team didn't know was that Sarah's connection to music went far deeper than anyone realized. At age 6, Sarah had survived a near-drowning accident at a family lake house that left her unconscious for several hours. The experience had been traumatic for the entire family. Sarah had fallen through thin ice while playing near the shore. By the time her father pulled her from the freezing water, she had been submerged for nearly 4 minutes. During her recovery in the pediatric intensive care unit, Sarah had remained unresponsive for days. Doctors warned the family that oxygen deprivation might have caused permanent brain damage. Her mother, desperate to reach her daughter, had played Elvis songs continuously beside her hospital bed. Margaret believed that familiar music might somehow penetrate the darkness where medical intervention had failed. Sarah's first word after the accident wasn't "Mama" or "Daddy." It was Elvis. She had opened her eyes during "Love Me Tender" and whispered the name that would become central to her identity. From that moment, music became Sarah's lifeline, her language of healing, her connection to consciousness itself. The 6-year-old girl who nearly died in that lake grew up to become a passionate music educator. She learned piano by ear, memorizing every Elvis song ever recorded. Her college thesis had been on the neurological effects of music therapy on trauma patients. She had spent countless hours researching the connection between music and brain healing, driven by her own mysterious recovery 20 years earlier. Sarah had even written a letter to Elvis once, explaining how his music had literally saved her life as a child. She had poured her heart into that letter, describing the accident, her recovery, and her belief that music had healing powers that medical science didn't fully understand. But the letter was never sent. Sarah had convinced herself that Elvis received thousands of fan letters, and her story would never reach him. Now, 20 years later, Elvis's voice was about to save her life again. "Margaret, come quickly!" Sarah's eyes are moving. Dr. Anderson's voice carried through the ICU as she watched Sarah's closed eyelids flutter in perfect rhythm with "Love Me Tender" echoing through the hospital's sound system. Margaret Matthews looked up from the book she had been reading aloud, the same book she had read to Sarah every day for 3 months. Romeo and Juliet had been Sarah's favorite Shakespeare play, and Margaret had hoped that familiar words might somehow reach her daughter's damaged mind. "What's happening?" Margaret asked, rushing to Sarah's bedside where Dr. Anderson was frantically adjusting monitoring equipment and checking readings that seemed to change with every note of Elvis's distant performance. "Her brain activity is increasing dramatically," Dr. Anderson explained, pointing to screens that showed neural patterns more complex and organized than anything they had recorded in 3 months. "These aren't random spikes. Her brain is actually processing the music, recognizing it, responding to it in ways that suggest conscious awareness. Look at these patterns. They're synchronized with the rhythm, the melody, even the emotional peaks of the songs. Dr. Anderson began frantically documenting everything she was witnessing. The brain activity wasn't just increasing, it was organizing itself in patterns that indicated complex cognitive processing. Areas of Sarah's brain that had been silent for months were suddenly lighting up with activity. The temporal lobe, responsible for processing music and emotion. The hippocampus, crucial for memory formation. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of higher cognitive function. "But that's impossible," Margaret whispered, her voice trembling as she watched the monitors display readings that seemed to contradict everything the doctors had told her. "You said her brain damage was too severe for conscious thought. You said the areas responsible for awareness were permanently damaged." "I said what medical science told me to say," Dr. Anderson replied. Her voice filled with wonder as she watched Sarah's monitors continue to light up with each song. "But I've never seen anything like this in 15 years of neurology practice. Her brain is not just responding to sound, it's responding specifically to Elvis's voice, to these particular songs, in ways that suggest deep recognition and emotional connection." The implications of what they were witnessing began to dawn on Dr. Anderson. If Sarah's brain could recognize and respond to specific music despite months of apparent unconsciousness, it suggested that consciousness might be far more resilient and complex than medical science understood. It meant that patients in vegetative states might be more aware than anyone realized. As Can't Help Falling in Love began playing through the hospital speakers, something extraordinary happened. Sarah's right hand, which had been motionless for 3 months, began to move. First just a slight tremor in her fingers, then a more deliberate movement, as if she was trying to reach for something. "Sarah, Sarah, can you hear me?" Margaret grabbed her daughter's moving hand, tears streaming down her face as she felt her daughter's fingers weakly squeeze back for the first time since the accident. Dr. Anderson immediately began conducting rapid neurological assessments, shining lights in Sarah's eyes, checking her reflexes, testing her responses to various stimuli. What she discovered defied every medical protocol she had ever learned. Sarah's pupils were responding to light. Her reflexes were returning. Most remarkably, her brain scans showed activity patterns that indicated not just consciousness, but complex cognitive processing. The areas of her brain that controlled memory, language, and emotional response were lighting up like a symphony of neural connections being re-established in real time. "Doctor, her vitals are stabilizing," Nurse Patricia reported, monitoring Sarah's heart rate, blood pressure, and oxygen levels. "Everything is moving toward normal ranges." 2 floors below, Elvis was reaching the emotional climax of his performance. He had no idea that his voice was traveling through the hospital building, carrying hope to places where medical science had offered none. As he sang "Love Me Tender" with all the emotion and power that had made him a legend, his voice was literally calling Sarah Matthews back from the edge of death. But the most remarkable moment was still to come. Sarah's eyes opened. Not the vacant, unfocused stare that sometimes accompanied brain injury recovery, but clear, aware, intelligent eyes that immediately sought out her mother's face. When their gazes met, Sarah's lips moved, forming words that hadn't been spoken in 3 months. Her voice was hoarse from the ventilator, weak from months of silence, but unmistakably her own. "Mama, I can hear Elvis singing." The room erupted in a chaos of emotion and medical urgency. Dr. Anderson dropped her clipboard, the sound of it hitting the floor lost in the commotion. Nurse Patricia gasped audibly, her hands flying to her mouth in shock. Margaret Matthews collapsed into the chair beside Sarah's bed, sobbing with relief and joy and disbelief all at once. But Sarah wasn't finished. As Elvis's voice continued to float through the hospital's ventilation system, she began to sing along. Weakly at first, her voice hoarse from months of intubation, but with growing strength and clarity as each note seemed to awaken more of her damaged brain. The sound of her voice joining Elvis's created a moment that transcended medical science and entered the realm of pure miracle. "Call the neurological team. Call everyone." Dr. Anderson shouted to Patricia as she watched readings that violated every principle of neuroscience she had ever studied. "Get Dr. Reynolds from Johns Hopkins on the phone. He needs to see this immediately." Dr. Anderson began conducting rapid neurological assessments, her hands shaking with excitement and disbelief. She shined lights in Sarah's eyes, testing pupil response. She checked reflexes that had been absent for months. She asked simple questions to test cognitive function. Every test revealed the impossible. Sarah's neurological function was not just returning, it was approaching normal levels. Sarah's pupils responded to light with perfect symmetry. Her reflexes were strong and appropriate. When Dr. Anderson asked her to squeeze her mother's hand, Sarah complied immediately. When asked to follow a moving finger with her eyes, Sarah tracked it perfectly. When asked her name, birth date, and location, Sarah answered all questions correctly. But Sarah was focused only on the music, on the voice that had reached her in the darkness where medical science couldn't follow. As Elvis sang "Can't Help Falling in Love," Sarah sang along, her voice growing stronger with each word, each note seeming to repair neural pathways that trauma had severed months earlier. "Doctor, her vitals are completely stabilizing," Nurse Patricia reported, monitoring Sarah's heart rate, blood pressure, and oxygen levels with amazement. Heart rate is 68 beats per minute, blood pressure is 120/80, oxygen saturation is 98%. Everything is moving toward completely normal ranges. The medical team that gathered in response to Dr. Anderson's emergency calls could hardly believe what they were witnessing. Dr. Sarah Chen, the hospital's chief of neurosurgery, stood in stunned silence as she reviewed Sarah's brain scans from that morning compared to real-time readings. Dr. Marcus Williams, head of the trauma unit, shook his head in disbelief as he watched a patient he had written off as hopeless demonstrate perfect cognitive function. But Sarah was focused only on the music, on the voice that had reached her in the darkness where medical science couldn't follow. As Elvis sang "Can't Help Falling in Love," Sarah sang along, her voice growing stronger with each word, each note seeming to repair neural pathways that trauma had severed. Dr. Michael Reynolds from Johns Hopkins arrived by helicopter 6 hours later, summoned by Dr. Anderson's frantic phone call, claiming that she had witnessed medical impossibility in real time. Dr. Reynolds was one of the world's leading experts on traumatic brain injury and coma recovery. He had seen thousands of cases, published hundreds of research papers, and consulted on neurological mysteries around the globe. But nothing had prepared him for what he found in Room 7 of the intensive care unit. Sarah was awake, alert, and conducting an impromptu interview with local news reporters who had been covering Elvis's charity concert and learned about the medical miracle happening upstairs. She spoke clearly, remembered everything about her life before the accident, demonstrated normal cognitive function, and showed no signs of the severe brain damage that had been documented in months of medical tests. "This is neurologically impossible," Dr. Reynolds said after reviewing Sarah's complete medical history and current brain scans. The level of brain trauma documented in her initial scans should have resulted in permanent vegetative state or death. There's no medical explanation for this level of recovery. But Sarah had an explanation that challenged everything the medical community thought they knew about the power of music, memory, and human consciousness. "When I was 6 years old, I nearly drowned," Sarah explained to the gathering of doctors, nurses, reporters, and family members. "The doctors said I was brain dead for several minutes before they revived me. During my recovery, my mother played Elvis songs constantly. She believed that familiar music would help my brain heal. The first word I spoke after that accident was Elvis." Sarah paused, her voice growing stronger as she continued. "For 20 years, Elvis's music has been connected to my deepest memories, my strongest emotions, my sense of identity. When I was unconscious these past 3 months, I could hear everything happening around me, but I couldn't respond. It was like being trapped in my own mind. But when I heard Elvis singing tonight, his voice created a pathway through the damage. It was like he was calling me back to life." Dr. Anderson had been recording everything, documenting what would become one of the most studied cases in neurological history. Sarah's recovery wasn't just medically significant, it was revolutionary. It suggested that certain combinations of memory, emotion, and sensory input could potentially overcome even severe brain trauma. The implications were staggering. If music therapy could access neural pathways that traditional medicine couldn't reach, it might revolutionize treatment for coma patients, stroke victims, and others with traumatic brain injuries. But the story was far from over. Elvis, who had been informed about Sarah's miraculous recovery, insisted on meeting her personally. When he walked into her hospital room the next morning, Sarah broke down crying. "Mr. Presley," she said through her tears, "your music saved my life twice, once when I was 6, and again last night. I owe you everything." Elvis was visibly moved by Sarah's story. He sat beside her bed and talked with her for over an hour, learning about her work as a music teacher, her passion for helping underprivileged children, and her dreams of using music therapy to help other trauma patients. "Young lady," Elvis said as he prepared to leave, "you don't owe me anything. If my music helped bring you back, then you've given me the greatest gift I could ever receive. You've shown me that music isn't just entertainment, it's healing." Before he left, Elvis made a promise that would change Sarah's life forever. He pledged to fund a music therapy research program at Nashville General Hospital, with Sarah as its director once she completed her recovery. The Sarah Matthews Music Therapy Institute opened 18 months later, funded by Elvis and dedicated to studying the neurological effects of music on trauma patients worldwide. Sarah, who made a complete recovery with no lasting effects from her brain injury, led groundbreaking research that revolutionized the treatment of coma patients around the globe. The institute became a beacon of hope for families facing the unthinkable, and a center of cutting-edge research that challenged everything the medical community thought they knew about consciousness and recovery. Her first major study followed 50 coma patients over 2 years, using personalized music therapy based on each patient's musical memories and emotional connections. The research team discovered that patients who received music therapy specifically tailored to their personal musical histories showed dramatically improved outcomes. The results were unprecedented: a 43% improvement in recovery rates compared to traditional treatment methods alone. Dr. Reynolds, who had initially dismissed Sarah's recovery as a medical fluke, became one of the Institute's strongest supporters and collaborators after witnessing similar recoveries in patients treated with Sarah's music therapy protocols. He relocated his research from Johns Hopkins to Nashville to work directly with Sarah's team, bringing decades of neurological expertise to complement her revolutionary approach. "The case changed our understanding of consciousness itself," Dr. Reynolds wrote in a landmark paper published in the New England Journal of Medicine 3 years after Sarah's recovery. Sarah Matthews proved that the human brain has healing capabilities that we're only beginning to understand. Music, memory, and emotion can create neural pathways that bypass traditional anatomical limitations and restore function that medical science previously considered permanently lost. Margaret Matthews, who had never stopped believing her daughter would recover, became a full-time volunteer at the Institute, working with families of coma patients and sharing Sarah's story as proof that hope should never be abandoned. She developed support programs for family members, helping them understand how to use music and personal connections to potentially reach their loved ones trapped in consciousness disorders. The media attention from Sarah's recovery brought international focus to music therapy research and neurological rehabilitation. Hospitals around the world began implementing similar programs, and thousands of families found new hope for their loved ones trapped in consciousness disorders. Medical schools began incorporating music therapy into their neurological training programs, and research funding for consciousness studies increased dramatically. But perhaps the most significant impact was on Elvis himself. The experience of witnessing Sarah's recovery, of learning that his music had literally saved someone's life not once but twice, profoundly influenced his perspective on the responsibility that came with his fame and influence. He began incorporating more meaningful music into his performances, songs that connected with people's deepest emotions and memories rather than just entertaining them. In interviews during his final years, Elvis often referenced Sarah's story as proof that music had healing power beyond entertainment value. He established the Elvis Presley Foundation for Music Therapy Research, which continues to fund groundbreaking studies decades after his death. The foundation has contributed millions of dollars to consciousness research and has helped establish music therapy programs in over 200 hospitals worldwide. Sarah Matthews went on to become one of the world's leading experts on music therapy for neurological trauma and consciousness disorders. She published numerous research papers that became required reading in medical schools, trained hundreds of therapists who carried her methods around the world, and developed treatment protocols that have helped thousands of patients recover from brain injuries that were once considered completely hopeless. Her institute has documented over 300 cases of dramatic improvement in coma patients treated with personalized music therapy approaches. While not every case results in complete recovery like Sarah's miraculous awakening, the success rate far exceeds traditional treatment methods, and even partial improvements represent life-changing progress for patients and families. Today, the Sarah Matthews Music Therapy Institute continues its pioneering work from its expanded campus in Nashville, proving every day that the human brain's capacity for healing extends far beyond what medical textbooks suggest. Sarah, now in her 70s, still works directly with patients and their families, sharing her story as living proof that miracles can happen when science, hope, and the healing power of music combine in ways that transcend our current understanding. The night Elvis's voice called Sarah back from the darkness changed more than one life. It changed medical science, challenged our understanding of consciousness, and proved that sometimes the most powerful medicine comes not from a pharmacy, but from the heart. Elvis's charity concert that night raised $47,000 for Nashville General Hospital. But the real gift was much more valuable than money. It was the gift of possibility, the proof that human connection can transcend the limitations of medical science, and the reminder that sometimes a song can save a life in ways that medicine cannot explain. Dr. Anderson, who documented Sarah's recovery and co-founded the Music Therapy Institute, often tells medical students that Sarah's case taught her the most important lesson of her career: never underestimate the healing power of hope, love, and music. The brain monitors showed impossible readings that night. Dr. Anderson concludes her lectures. But sometimes impossible is just another word for miracle waiting to happen. Sarah's story continues to inspire researchers, therapists, and families around the world. It serves as proof that consciousness is far more resilient and mysterious than we understand, and that sometimes the most powerful healing happens not in operating rooms, but in moments when the human spirit refuses to surrender. The ventilation system at Nashville General Hospital still carries sound from the main auditorium to every floor of the building. And sometimes, when special concerts are held in memory of that miraculous night in 1976, staff members report that patients on the upper floors seem more responsive, more hopeful, as if Elvis's voice is still calling people back to life. What would you do if you discovered that music could heal in ways medicine cannot? Share your thoughts about the power of music in healing and recovery in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories about the moments when science meets miracle.